the wholeness of the Amazon offering makes it really compelling. And just knowing that you're going to get things so quickly. And, for some products, as you'd be well aware in New York, ordering and then having them arrive 3 hours later, it's mind-boggling that it happens. But once people have tasted that, it makes going back to what they knew incredibly difficult.
This is the E-Commerce Braintrust, a podcast about building momentum online for established consumer brands. Join our hosts and their expert guests for high-level conversations about e-commerce strategies, trends, and innovations. Access our Braintrust and boost your brand's e-commerce potential.
Hello and welcome to the Ecommerce Braintrust podcast. I'm Kiri Masters, your host, and I'm joined by your co-host, Julie Spear.
Hello.
So today we're talking about a topic that's near and dear to my heart as an Australian, which is Amazon's launch in Australia. And this has been much anticipated for almost the whole of 2017. There's been a lot of rumors about when Amazon would launch, what it would look like, how it would change the retail landscape. And Australians are very much looking forward to Amazon launching in Australia because it would provide some competition and particularly on the shipping timeframe and the value that people could get out of online shopping, it would be a real game changer. So we recorded this interview with a Australian retail expert, Scott Kilmartin. It turns out the interview was recorded just a couple of days before Amazon Australia actually launched. So some of the conversation veers into territory, which is we're beyond that point now that we've launched, but we still want to run this interview, and Julie and I will give a recap at the end of what we thought is interesting and different about this launch compared to other marketplace launches, because it does still give us some context about what Amazon is planning to do in Australia and where we think they will go. So, Julie, before we get into the interview, is there anything that you want to prime our listeners to listen out for?
One section that I liked is how you and Scott dug into what the Australian customer looks like and, what their purchasing habits are and how they adapt trends. And so I think for brands looking to expand into the Australian marketplace, I think that is an interesting part of the conversation to pay attention to.
Yeah, definitely. I think that Australians are pretty worldly and big travelers, and they like to follow trends internationally. But it seems like the rest of the world doesn't really understand Australians. And I'll just give a quick anecdote to illustrate this. I personally think this is hilarious. We have a YouTube channel for Bobsled marketing. And I got a comment on one of my videos the other day, which was an interview with friend of Bobsled marketing, Brent Zaradnik. And this comment said, I thought the content was pretty good, but I had to turn it off halfway through because of the girl's terrible fake British accent.
You've got to work on your fake British accent, Kiri.
My fake British accent really needs work.
It does.
I'll take that feedback on board. Thank you, anonymous YouTube commenter.
Well, I hope they don't listen to this because maybe I'll bust out my fake British accent, and I think that might be even more of a
yeah. Yeah, so I think the Australians have long been maligned, no Amazon Prime still, and so now that Amazon's arrived in Australia, I think we should be able to turn that around.
Yes, most definitely.
All right, let's get into the interview.
Hi, I'm Scott Kilmartin. I've been in e-commerce since 1999. I started selling online back when there were web pages, before there were platforms. I had a business called Haul, where we turned old advertising billboards into document satchels and laptop sleeves, and then grew that business out to supplying around 400 stores in Australia, New Zealand, and Southeast Asia. A few in the UK, and got online early, partly because most of my market was overseas. So we were one of those little niche brands that were bigger overseas than we were in Australia. I had to reach them. E-commerce was really clunky back then. You spent most of your time on the phone with people, walking them through how to do a transaction. It was the era of people were scared to put their credit card details online. It seems like a far removed era now. But it was also hard to do, much harder because there were no Shopify, BigCommerce, Magento, WooCommerce platforms. So you were literally hand coding from scratch. Sold a part of that business a few years ago, then jumped the fence, started an e-commerce agency called Online Store Guys, where we were building mid-tier e-commerce sites for brands that were selling in the kind of $2 to $40 million range. And I was the strategy partner of that business. A couple of years ago, I went off on my own and just started doing predominantly strategy for a couple of our bigger clients. And I've got some other interests, and I've been looking as an adjunct to that business, have an interview series called Online Offline, where it's a live series. We get probably 100, 150 people in a room. We video it and we interview them about what makes their brand successful, from their online presence to their packaging to their customer service to the look and feel, the tone of their copywriting. And as an adjunct to that, we were going to turn that into a weekly podcast series on e-commerce with a focus on Australia, when all the conversations started becoming around Amazon and its arrival and would it be a tsunami. We thought, why don't we push back the weekly e-commerce podcast back, maybe 3 months or so, and do a 10-part audio documentary on Amazon coming to Australia. Deep dive into that, and so that is called David versus Amazon. And the deeper I got into that, the more transfixed I become with Amazon in both shock and awe, which is where we're at today.
Yeah, that's amazing. And that's why I wanted to get you on the show as well, because as we're recording this on the 1st of December, Amazon hasn't fully launched in Australia, and it seems from all the communication, or lack of communication, I guess, that they've shared with sellers who have been onboarded onto the platform and everything, there's still no target date, but there is, like you say, just a ton of chatter about it. From what I've seen in the Australian media, obviously the incumbent retail store owners are range anywhere from poo-pooing the idea and saying it will never work in Australia and they can't possibly manage the cost and expense of shipping in Australia, or the wages, making excuses for it not to work, to, it's going to kill our jobs, kill our economy. So there's that side of things, which those retailers have an interest in Amazon not succeeding, obviously. And then some consumers have the same feeling, and a lot of them are saying, no, we want this, we want the convenience, we want the competition, bring it on. So where do you sit in all of that?
For businesses that have, there's still a lot of business in Australia that have paid lip service to e-commerce. They've got an e-commerce site. It's functional, but it doesn't feel like the modern best brands in the way that the great sites really operate. The other challenge for a lot of physical stores is there's not a lot of cohesion blending between their online offering and their their online offering and their offline offering. So often you would, if you walked into a store and then went on their online site, it wouldn't be difficult for a lot of people to go, is this the same business? So whilst businesses have adopted click and collect, they're not doing it particularly well. So for a lot of those businesses that are now in scurrying to catch up, Amazon is an enormous threat to them.
Absolutely. Well, I was back in Australia at the start of this year for a few months, and just walking around some of the strip malls, there were stores closing, and what I kind of likened it to is before supermarkets became popular, people would go to do your household shopping. You would go to a butcher, you would go to a bakery, you'd go to a produce store. And when supermarkets came along, people would make the same argument that supermarkets are going to put butchers and bakeries and produce stores out of business. And they kind of did. But you know what? They also created all these other jobs, and people ended up migrating to shopping at supermarkets because it was more convenient. And that's the thing that you can't argue with, is that to make a consumer's life easier and to make selection broader and shopping more convenient and more value driven, what can you possibly do to prevent that? And I think that in a lot of cases, the people arguing the loudest against someone like Amazon coming to Australia just haven't really innovated in a long time, or, like you said, differentiated their product or service offering.
Other retailers don't have the ability to compete with. Department stores in Australia aren't going to come up with an original content media channel overnight to have something that competes with Amazon. And that's the same way that, in Australia we have Myer and David Jones, which is, your Myer, Bloomingdale's, Neiman Marcus in the States. And the wholeness of the Amazon offering makes it really compelling. And just knowing that you're going to get things so quickly. And, for some products, as you'd be well aware, in New York, ordering and then having them arrive 3 hours later, it's mind-boggling that it happens. But once people have tasted that, it makes going back to what they knew incredibly difficult. So the challenges here are the challenges that we've seen elsewhere. I've been researching particularly Canada, which is often referenced to being similar to Australia. It's a relatively small population with a really big geography. Amazon don't have as big a market penetration there as they do in the US, and trying to find where the similarities are. But also in the UK, talking to some friends of mine, I spent a year living in Dublin and spent a lot of time in the UK, and I've still got a bunch of friends there, and just talking about how particularly Prime has changed their shopping and consuming habits. And so as part of this, as part of the audio doco series, we've been trying to say, Amazon isn't a new product. It's not like an iPhone launch where there's a new iPhone X coming next week. It's a new way of shopping. And for a lot of people, they're like, well, it's really just buying the same products that I could mostly buy elsewhere on a new platform. I'm like, it is that, but it's so much more. And the other things, the convenience factor and the unlimited range, I think will take a while to kick in once the initial novelty of launch, whenever they do launch, whether that's before Christmas here or afterwards. And that's still really up in the air. But I think it's once people get their head around the fact that you are not just getting all these products online that as you mentioned, you traditionally would have had to buy from multiple different places. In Australia, we're only going to open with one warehouse in Melbourne, which is a bit of like a city, a bit like a San Francisco, I guess, for your US audience. Ultimately, the Eastern Seaboard will have, there'll be a warehouse in Sydney, there'll be a warehouse in somewhere between probably Brisbane and the Gold Coast, and then on the West Coast in Perth. And I think once they've got a footprint of warehouses on the East Coast in Australia, then you'll see Prime rolled out to its fullest degree. I think it'll happen similarly to what's happened in Singapore, of all places. Well, Singapore is effectively, a one huge city that is a country in Southeast Asia. They rolled out Prime there in a couple of stages. So they rolled out Prime in a couple of categories, not the full range. And I expect that Prime will be rolled out in a similar way in Australia, possibly not with categories, but it will be offered initially from a regional perspective. The Eastern Seaboard, the big cities, of which the majority of the Australian population live in, will get Prime, and then it'll gradually go out to the more regional areas.
That makes sense. That was something I was going to ask you about, because I grew up in Perth and I lived in Sydney for a few years, and it just doesn't seem, a lot of things that Amazon does are illogical, but it seems to defy almost the law of physics for Amazon to be able to get products from Melbourne to Perth in 2 days. And the equivalent would be, getting like a package from New York to LA in 2 days, but with 1/5 of the population. So
Yes, I think your hometown will be the last place in Australia, or definitely the last big city to experience crime. Just because, I mean, there used to be that line that Perth was the most isolated city in the world, which I'm not sure whether it still is, but it is far from kind of everywhere in Australia. So I would expect that they would be probably the last recipient. We'll see how it plays out. But the bigger thing here is, will they launch when they're going to launch? It's crazy. We've seen Amazon's impact in the US by being able to affect other industries and share prices of its competitors by simply announcing it's thinking about going into pharmacy, or it's thinking when the rumors of it going before the purchase of Whole Foods, watching Kroger's share price plummet. I think it potentially could have a similar impact here. It definitely is having an impact on the share price of Myer and David Jones and some of those big traditional department stores. But it could definitely have an impact on Christmas sales. If people know that Amazon's coming, they will potentially hold their dollars. So their options, because of their power and their brand, are many and varied depending on the way they want to roll out.
Definitely. And so something else I was going to ask you to get your take on is, why do you think Amazon has chosen 2017/2018 to launch in Australia? Why didn't they do it earlier? And I guess the reverse question is, why do it at all? I mean, Australia's only 22 million people, like you said, similar size as Canada, even smaller population. So, why now for Australia?
That's a question that I've literally posed to a couple of people this week. I was in Sydney last week, and I went and interviewed a guy called Tony Nash, who started a business in Australia called Booktopia. And Booktopia is the biggest online bookseller in Australia. It was modeled on Amazon. Tony Nash started that business the same day Facebook opened. So he's been around for a long time, and Tony's particularly interesting. And the reason I wanted to get him on David versus Amazon, because unlike a lot of retailers in Australia who are getting ready to go to battle with Amazon for customers and market share, he's been battling Amazon since the day that he opened. And I asked Tony, I was like, why now? And he goes, I'm amazed they didn't open earlier. To him, he goes, there's whilst it is a small country, for all the things we just talked about, he goes, there is a market here, and the stats would indicate, whilst they don't absolutely release the stats, the purchasing of Australians on Amazon.com in the US, both books and predominantly tech products, and if they want to sort out third party freight, has often been the way to buy clothing through Amazon through a third party shipper or a consolidated shipper has been the way that lots of people have got, especially when the Australian dollar was quite high and it was super competitive to buy out of the US. So Tony was amazed they weren't here earlier. As to why they're doing it now, really hard to know. The announcement that came in Australia yesterday was that Amazon out of Seattle announced that they are bringing Alexa to Australia by next Christmas. So possibly the reason for coming to Australia is, whilst it is relatively small, is trying to just grow that voice business. Amazon's got other businesses here. Amazon Web Services has been here for a long time. It has a huge market share as it does in the US. So they definitely have a footprint here. But I think the announcement yesterday might be either the answer or a good part of the answer to why now. It's, they're coming here and there's a market they can service, but maybe the bigger play for them is all the things that come with voice and their Amazon's attempt to dominate home.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, Australia does have it's an affluent population. People are already buying online, but there was a big opportunity for them to get into a market that is sort of underserved from an e-commerce standpoint in a lot of ways.
And I think down here, it's a little bit like an outer settlement in some respects. They will initially service New Zealand out of Australia, and then I'd expect that they would have warehousing of some form in New Zealand. But I think there are, going up into Asia, there's lots of different things Amazon can do with warehousing and stock and stuff using Australia as some kind of base, as well as just the consumer market that offers. So there is they used to, if you think of it in the old days of military terms, the US always had a base in Australia, to often collect satellite data, and then there was always military bases in lots of other countries. I think Australia could have that, a kind of a version of that where there's absolutely a consumer market down here, but there's a lot of space in Australia, and it definitely is a kind of whilst not the dominant or the biggest hub in Southeast Asia, it overpunches for its weight in terms of its influence in this region. So I think there's lots of other things in play, speculation, but it kind of makes sense in terms of the way other businesses have, the way they've viewed Australia as an outpost.
Right. And so since most people listening to this show are brands and retailers located in the US, what can you tell us about how Australians purchase differently, or any differences in either psychology or expectation that brands and retailers should expect once they start selling to Australians? And I will say that just before you answer that question, the reason why a lot of brands are interested in going to Australia, even though it's a much smaller population, is that Australians are very worldly, and they're always in touch with these brands in the States saying, please send me your products in Australia. I don't mind spending a $200 on shipping it out to me. I need it. And so brands find that they get a lot of attention from Australians, but at least from what my perspective and what I've heard, Australians are demanding customers and have high expectations. So what do you think brands and retailers should be aware of before they sort of start figuring out their operations and getting products into Australia and then marketing to Australians?
We've all seen those Instagram comments and Facebook's comments going, please ship to Australia. Why don't you ship out here? And people showing screenshots of this seller or this product does not ship to your location, and your brand,
like you're on a different planet.
It is a little bit, isn't it? Yeah. Please send this to Mars. To give your audience a little bit of perspective on, Australia we're 23.5 million people, is the size of Greater Los Angeles and a little bit of Orange County. It's not. We are particularly small, and we are, as we talked about, spread over an enormous. The size of Australia is not dissimilar to the geographic size of the US. So small population, predominantly on one side, which is the Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane side of the country. So Australians definitely love brands from afar, and always have. That's been a trend in retail here. Imported brands, or even imported beers, imported perfumes have been a really big thing from as far back as the 60s and 70s, kind of Mad Men era. And they've always had more of a cachet. Australia has definitely developed its own brands and its own kind of style of brands. And there's lots of brands doing particularly well in the US and in Asia. But Australian customers do have a reputation for being more demanding. They will, Australian customers are the kinds that will, if something's for sale on a special day, like the equivalent of a Prime Day or a Black Friday, and it goes out of stock, they're like, hey, can we get this at this price and this shipping rate locked in for future, regardless of whether that's been offered on the site. And lots of when I was an online retailer for a decade in the mid 2000s, that was definitely the place then, and it was a lot harder for people to contact brands back then. It was clunky online forms and long form email, where now it's so easy to send a tweet to a brand, or predominantly we're seeing the drive obviously towards Instagram as being the channel of choice for social interaction. So Australians are more demanding customers, but we like to perceive ourselves, I guess, as early adopters of both technology and brands. So the interesting thing is I noticed some of the stats around online sales in the States, and this Thanksgiving range of sales days where mobile sales accounted for just on 50% of the sales. The stats on mobile in Australia have been really slow. So we didn't really embrace and grab online, partly I think because the websites were a little bit clunky, and we stayed with the type of retail that we knew, which was going into physical stores. So what you're seeing now in the last 2 years, since 2015, I would say, you've seen a really big scaling up of when brands were paying not only much more attention to their e-commerce sites, but rolling out mobile specific sites that were stripped back, that loaded faster, that had much better search on mobile. So all of those factors made the mobile buying experience a little bit easier. And as we've seen with Apple Pay and a bunch of those other add-ons kick in, some of the Stripe features have made it easier and for customers when either credit card details and or addresses are in people's phones. There's been a high uptake of mobile purchases. So the other thing that's very true in Australian apparel, which I guess would affect some of your Amazon sellers, and it's definitely had an impact with fast fashion having a huge impact on the apparel business in Australia as it has in the US, is people still like to go into stores in Australia and figure out sizing. We've all had the experience of this shirt in a large might be 3 different sizes across 3 different brands, even inside the same brand with different cuts and things. Sizes can vary greatly, but once people have a product, let's in this case an apparel product they like, then they're much more willing to buy it online, particularly if they're buying it from that same brand. So the trend of first purchase in store and then follow up and ongoing purchases for things like maybe not that one absolute dress shirt, but basics where you might be buying boxer shorts or t-shirts you wear to the gym, or just the everyday shirt you'd be wearing for nothing special at the office, where you're buying them in plain colours. Absolutely, those things are migrating online, and I expect that to be, once Prime kicks in Australia, where it becomes so much more easier to do that. You'd be more than aware of, lots of people shop on Prime in the US by just going through their past purchases, especially for consumables. If you're a young family and you're buying lots of nappies and baby wipes and baby associated products, then you're buying those things weekly, sometimes multiple times during the week, and it's a previous purchase reorder. And so I expect that kind of trend to really happen in Australia once the full Amazon suite of products or services is rolled out.
Yeah, it's kind of almost unfathomable for American listeners who well over half of American households have Prime membership. It's almost unfathomable for many of them to imagine a world without Prime and without subscriptions and free 2-day delivery or even same-day delivery. So the fact that that our poor Australians have been without it for so long, and it's going to be such a novelty when it finally materializes is kind of mind-blowing.
I use the analogy of, can you remember I'm guessing I'm probably a little bit older than you, but there's the two things that, if you bring it up, people, even though it's only relatively soon, the iPhone's only been around for 10 years. Facebook, whilst it's been around for longer than that, it really only has really kind of taken over in say, the last 10 years. It's hard to remember what we did before that. The things that especially mobile phones and social media have replaced. If you're, as an American, I've spent a bit of time in the US, and the way that they grocery shop, the way that they reorder things, the way that Prime has in some of my friends' houses almost become, we don't say we search for things, we say we Google it. I've got some friends now that don't buy things online, they Prime it, and they name check that term, and those terms, Prime is not a term in the vocabulary in Australia. But I think by this time next Christmas, it absolutely will be, and we'll forget what it was like before those terms. I mean, you're probably, by the sounds of things, you're coming from a very interesting perspective, having been in the US for a little while, but recently been living in Australia and been back for a while, seeing the chalk and cheese of both experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. It will be fantastic to do a check-in again in a year's time and listen back to this and see what ended up happening and how quickly Australians really came on board with Prime, with Amazon.
It'll be interesting with the data, obviously, depending on whether someone's selling on the Amazon marketplace in the US or they're a vendor. And we know that they get dramatically different amounts of data, but to see what the take up of Australians is with US brands. So to give you a little bit more background, one of the things that Amazon has announced in Australia is that they are going to be opening with the marketplace here. And there was talk that that's all they would open with initially in the run to Christmas. But they are also opening with their vendor, not their vendor program, where they're selling their own products. So they're going to be selling a bunch of their technology products and Kindles, and there've been fashion shoots all over Melbourne and Sydney over the last couple of weeks. So I would imagine they will sell Amazon Basics and some of the Amazon private label brands. Whether there are other brands in that offering when they first open, it's hard to know. But you would imagine that if they do open before Christmas, once they get through the Christmas period, then it'll be a constant Lego adding on to the products and categories they're offering here. But the interesting thing for your sellers in the US will be to see the take up of Australians not just buying from local retailers and brands on the marketplace to what they pull in from the US now that will open up.
Yep, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on the e-commerce Braintrust podcast, Scott, and I'm really looking forward to getting into your audio series. Is it live now, or when will it?
What we decided to do, it was going to go up this weekend. We're going to hold it back, and we're going to launch it on Friday. So a week from now. So probably around the time. Yeah, so probably around the time you're thinking of putting this up, we'll probably launch 2 episodes at once. And if Amazon are going to open, it looks like it may open. If they're going to, like I mentioned, the last chance of them opening before Christmas would have to be around that time. So it may coincide with that. And then there'll be 2 episodes a week for the 5 weeks that it runs.
Oh, great! And so where can people find that? David versus Goliath, Amazon, is it?
Yeah, davidversusamazon.com. If they go there and sign up, there's a little trailer teaser video there, and we pull in some stuff from Scott Galloway at L2, who's obviously been very vocal with his videos about Amazon, and as well as some you'll hear some Australian voices of some Australian retailers there as well. So it's exciting. It's been a really fun project. I've kind of treated it a little bit like writing a book, where you think it's going to take this long, and you so deep dive into it. You end up down a whole bunch of rabbit holes you just didn't expect or see coming. So good fun.
I bet. Thanks, Scott.
Kiri, love to talk to you.
So that was a great interview with Scott Kilmartin. Scott has been putting together this audio documentary series, David versus Amazon. I'm really looking forward to it when it comes out. It actually comes out, if you're listening to this podcast on the day that we go live, Scott's audio documentary is going to go live on Friday. So definitely go to davidversusamazon.com to check that out. And so, Julie, after listening to the interview with Scott, what are some of the top things that you took away about Amazon's launch in Australia?
I think we all have very high hopes for what Amazon in Australia could look like. And it's interesting to me, and that it seems that Amazon is going slowly into Australia. Yeah. While the launch was yesterday, December 4th, they didn't go full on. And I think I find that interesting. And I think that Scott has a perspective that I share as well, that this would be a big entrance into the market in Australia. And it doesn't seem to be shaping up that way quite yet. This being Amazon, we don't know totally how it will shake out. And I have faith that it will be bigger than it started yesterday. But it was interesting, the difference between what we expected and the reality of how it's unfolded so far.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's while we're on the topic, let's dive into some of those differences and things that are currently, as of recording this podcast, absent from Amazon Australia that we would expect to see and have certainly been rolled out in other marketplaces. One is that there's no Prime program in Australia, and this is a pretty huge, well, it's a critical part of Amazon's flywheel, really, that psychological lock-in effect that people experience when they purchase the Prime membership for a year, the free guaranteed 2-day shipping, easy returns, just no hassles, really, if something doesn't work out. So on amazon.com.au, it says that Prime shipping is coming to Australia. The little announcement, I'm just reading it now, it says, we are working hard to bring Australia the program enjoyed by tens of millions of Prime members around the world. We can't share everything we're working on yet, but if you want to get exclusive Prime updates, notifications on future launches, and information about other exciting services, just register your email above. So they have basically confirmed that Prime is coming. We don't know when. We don't know what it looks like in terms of what the free shipping will include. So as Scott and I talked about, getting a package from Melbourne on the eastern seaboard to Perth on the western seaboard, I don't think that they would be able to accommodate free 2-day shipping for that distance and for that size of population.
Yeah, I think Scott did a good job of kind of explaining, while in other markets, Amazon seemed to roll out by category, it almost seems like in Australia, Amazon will roll out the availability of Prime more geographically, that they'll build their customer base, prove the demand, and then build from there, is how I understood the idea of how they'll actually build out in Australia, which seems to make sense based on the geographical spread of Australia.
Yes. Yeah, and what he said about Singapore was interesting. That rolled out. Singapore didn't have Amazon at all, and then next minute they have Prime. You know, the instant Prime. What is it? Prime, like the 1 hour delivery.
Prime Now, yeah.
Prime Now, yeah. So
I don't even have
They've
that
done
yet
it differently
where I live.
Get your priorities right.
No, Amazon, Cleveland Market. Come on.
Yeah, and of course with Prime, obviously this was a big disappointment to Australian consumers, along with selection and price, but we can get into that later. The big issue for that with brands who are looking to go to Australia and launch in that market is that there isn't any FBA option yet. So if you're a brand and you've been looking forward to Amazon's launch in Australia because it means that you can streamline fulfillment in Australia, which is, I believe, ultimately what will happen, that option isn't available yet. So there's no option to ship your inventory to Amazon's fulfillment center in Melbourne as of yet.
Yeah, it definitely feels like it's been like the soft launch, like when a restaurant opens and they just have a couple nights where it's just for friends and family, and then they really go full tilt. It feels that way right now for Amazon Australia. I expect the full tilt is to come, but it's a gentle entry into the market.
It's a good point. And there are some other features missing. I'll link up in the show notes to an article that I wrote on the day of the launch, sort of talking about what was missing from amazon.com.au. But another thing that's missing is ad placements. There's no option for brands on Seller Central or on the vendor platform to create product ads or brand advertising. There's no product reviews that are pulled in from other markets. So generally with products that have few or no reviews, Amazon will pull in product reviews from other markets. So for example, a new product in Canada would generally surface reviews from the US marketplace, but that doesn't exist. And so that is a really critical part of the buying experience on Amazon, and Australians don't get to see any of those reviews. So I thought that was kind of strange.
I feel like that's to come, because I do think that is and I mean, that's part of what has set Amazon apart for a customer experience for so
Yep.
long are those product reviews. So I feel like that is to come. And advertising. Although
Yeah.
who knows how long it'll take for AMS to get to Australia for vendors. AMS only just came to Canada
Right.
for vendors.
Yeah.
So that could still be a ways out, but I have to believe sponsored products in Seller Central is something that will be available sooner than later.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, I think the overall, going back to your point about a soft launch, which I think is a really good one because it is very streamlined, the offering on Amazon right now. They weren't aggressive with recruiting sellers. In fact, a lot of people that I know who applied to be sellers on amazon.com.au, who are established sellers on .com, never got approved. They're still waiting. Amazon just, they weren't aggressive in recruiting sellers, and that recruiting sellers is what drives prices down and what expands selection. So that has had an effect on a couple of things that are important to Amazon customers: price and selection. And then the other one, value around the Prime program. I will say that they, because of the free shipping over 49 Australian dollars, which is about 32 or 33 US dollars, that helps a lot. But the reaction from Australians so far has been one of disappointment and underwhelm generally. And so I wonder if by doing this soft launch, they've kind of shot themselves in the foot because there's been a negative reaction to it. So even if they end up bringing in Prime, even if they end up bringing in these other features which make the platform more useful to browse and shop on, they may have kind of like taken a step back before they can take a step forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't want anyone to have a frustration or a frustrated reaction in response to your launch. So, or a disappointed reaction. So maybe, I know Scott predicted in your interview, he thought that there was a chance of a focus on Boxing Day for a launch. And maybe that's still a target for a grander entrance. I think that remains to be seen of how this will shake out in terms of the product selection available to customers, the features available on Seller Central, and will they be going after sellers to sell in the Australian market a little bit more aggressively now that I guess the basic framework is open and available?
Yeah. And so you mentioned before we got into the interview, one of your takeaways from Scott and my conversation was about how Australian consumers are a little bit different. What do you think sellers and brands need to take away from this episode in terms of considerations for their Australian launch?
Well, one, I like hearing that they're early adopters. That bodes well. So that's a good thing. I thought it was interesting, the point that it sounds like Australian customers, and you could give me your take on this, Kiri, would be fans of something like the rain check, of if there's the sale that's running on a product and there's a stock out, the Australian customer, it seems like their process would be to contact the seller and say, hey, when it comes back in stock, I want this deal. And that's an interesting, there might be a higher level of communication between the buyer and seller in the Australian marketplace based on that characterization of Australians as customers. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. There'll be a lot more interaction, especially initially, because it's a new platform as well. So people don't yet have the experience of shopping on Amazon, so they probably have a little bit more, a few more questions. Want to make sure when something's going to arrive, because it's an untested platform for many people. They're probably going to want to interact with sellers a bit more. And since there's no FBA option, brands will have to accommodate those interactions themselves. So that's definitely a good point, and a consideration for brands if they're launching in this current environment where there's no FBA option, that there's going to be more of a customer service load.
Yeah, it seems like that would be a heavier emphasis at this stage.
Great. Well, I think this is like you said, Julie, the first step in several into the Australian market, and something that we will consider doing on a future episode if there's interest and feedback to support it, is talking about the tax and compliance implications of selling on Amazon Australia. I know that you're so excited about that one already, Julie.
But it taxes, is, I say, when is that episode? No. It's an important topic.
It is. Yeah. Anytime a brand is considering launching in a new marketplace, we field a lot of questions from brands wanting to launch in Europe and Canada and the UK, places that we've supported brands with previously. And we give them a long list of compliance things to do. And we don't hear back from about 90% of inquiries, I think, because there's a lot of things, a lot of ducks to get in a row when it comes to tax and compliance. And they're things you don't want to skip, because Amazon is a huge target for tax authorities around the world. And so they're getting that kind of pressure to be open and transparent with the sellers on their platform and how compliant they are. And that gets passed on to sellers. So you can't really skip any steps here. And so getting products into Australia, the import tariffs and taxes, setting up an Australian bank account to get funds remitted to. Although with Amazon generally, you can get funds deposited into any international bank account within a certain most countries. But with the Australia launch so far, people have needed an Australian bank account. It's another quirk that's turned a lot of sellers off. So we can get into that topic in a future episode. Please give us your feedback and let us know if that's something that you're interested in hearing about. And again, to go back to Scott's projects, there is davidversusamazon.com. And then he also has an interview series with brands in Australia talking about their retail strategies and how things are going there. And that is called Online Offline. And we'll link up to those in the show notes at ecommercebraintrust.com.
Yeah, that online offline seems like it would be another good resource for brands and sellers thinking about expanding into Australia to get an even clearer picture of the Australian customer and, product demand in the Australian market.
Definitely. All right, Julie, thanks for your time. I'll catch you on the next episode.
Thanks, Carrie.